They had built their world on an unshakable foundation of hubris. They genuinely believed themselves untouchable, impervious to the mandates of distant kings, beyond the reach of conquering armies, and even immune to the judgment of the divine itself. Their grand delusion shattered on a single fateful morning. "I am ready. Please continue." As Sodom and Gomorrah ascended on a tide of accumulated wealth, cultivating an intoxicating atmosphere of profound arrogance and an insatiable hunger for domination. This unchecked ambition transformed their city streets into an open-air theater where the gentle voice of conscience was brutally silenced and every act of mercy was publicly scorned and ridiculed. The catastrophe that followed was not merely an ancient allegory or a fantastic myth. It was the consequence of a definitive line crossed, a devastating judgment that history has desperately attempted to inter entirely beneath layers of sulfurous ash and crusts of bitter salt. But the deep earth retains its memory. The most ancient texts still convey a chilling whisper, and locked beneath centuries of silence resides a profound secret, a clear warning written not exclusively for those doomed cities, but destined for every civilization and every generation that treads the path they paved. You are about to step into a hidden realm of forbidden memories and profound, untold stories, a sacred intersection where unwavering faith converges with the meticulous findings of archaeology, all situated precariously at the very edge of the fathomless unknown. We acknowledge the gravity of this endeavor. Proceed with measured steps. Absorb every sound. The narrative you are about to witness will fundamentally challenge the structure of everything you currently believe you comprehend. To truly grasp the reasons for the downfall of those great cities, we must pivot. We begin not with the sin, but with a solitary man and a foundational promise potent enough to fundamentally restructure human history. Long before the acrid smoke ever darkened the skies above Sodom, before the scorching fire had even touched the fertile plain, there was an ordinary man standing beneath an alien, star-dusted sky, attending to a voice that only he could perceive. His name was Abram, son of Terah, a silent presence navigating a deafening world saturated with colossal empires and demanding idols, a place where deities were meticulously chiseled from cold stone, and where survival itself was consistently measured by the currency of fear. He matured within the shadow of towering ziggurats and elaborate temples, watching as generations climbed the terraced steps of baked brick, routinely offering sweet incense and costly sacrifices to silent, unresponsive stone statues. The prevailing wisdom of the age dictated that the heavens were perpetually crowded with capricious, volatile deities, easily provoked to wrath, but just as easily appeased through lavish bribery. Real power resided exclusively with the reigning kings, the disciplined armies, and the demanding patron gods of the monolithic city-states. No decree, no sacred text, had ever informed Abram that there was one singular, unseen God who had inscribed his name into the annals of history even before the foundations of the physical world were laid. And then, that solitary God spoke, breaking through the silence of the cosmos with devastating clarity. Depart from your native land. Separate yourself from your extended family. Leave the security of your father's house. Go forth to the uncharted land that I myself will reveal to you. In that precise moment of divine utterance, the future destruction was absent. No horrifying pillars of salt, no terrifying deluge of burning sulfur, no infamous cities yet marked for obliteration. There was only the raw force of a command coupled with a monumental promise, suspended in the dry air like thunder that had not yet gathered the power to break the sky. I will establish you as a mighty nation. I will pour out my blessing upon you. I will elevate your name to greatness, and you yourself shall become a channel of blessing. Furthermore, all the scattered families of the earth shall find their blessing through you. This was far beyond the typical demands of a regional, tribute-seeking local deity. This was the audacious intervention of the Creator of all things, deliberately restructuring the destiny of one aging nomad to ultimately reach and transform the whole of humanity. Yet, this magnificent promise arrived intricately bound in the absolute certainty of impossibility. Abram had already reached the age of 75. His beloved wife, Sarai, remained tragically unable to bear children. The explosive potential of the divine promise stood starkly, agonizingly, face to face with the grim reality of human barrenness. right there within the fragile confines of his tent. A sacred promise invariably draws the human heart into a crucible of testing. Abram possessed every reason to remain rooted. He could have easily opted for the familiar security of ancestral walls, the predictable rituals of his father's gods, and the tangible comfort of settled agriculture. Instead, he resolutely stepped onto an unmarked, trackless road, his only guide being the authoritative word of a God who remained completely invisible. In an age fundamentally obsessed with erecting megalithic cities intended to pierce the clouds, Abram deliberately chose a radically different existence. A transient life defined by movable tents and stationary altars. Consequently, Abram set forth, just as the Lord had unequivocally commanded him. His collection of simple, woven tents constituted his only architecture. The rough-hewn altars he built served as his singular monuments to memory. At every encampment, he erected neither defensive fortress nor aspirational tower. He constructed an altar and devoutly invoked the name of the Lord. While the great civilizations of his era anchored their collective identity securely in permanent stone and durable baked brick, Abram chose to delineate his entire life's pilgrimage purely through acts of worship, acting as if every piece of ground where he momentarily paused belonged irrevocably more to God than it ever could to himself. Crucially, he did not walk alone. Trudging faithfully beside him, sharing the choking dust, the gnawing hunger, and the fragile hope, was his nephew Lot, the son of a brother tragically lost too early. Lot himself had not been privileged to hear the divine voice directly, yet he willingly followed in the undeniable slipstream of Abram's obedience. The promised blessing poured out onto Abram, immediately overflowing onto his nephew. Their respective flocks dramatically increased. Their servants multiplied rapidly. Their combined camps swelled substantially, resembling twin constellations of prosperity, slowly moving across the vast, challenging landscape. They eventually arrived in Canaan, a territory already possessing its own name, already fiercely claimed by various entrenched Canaanite kings. To the ordinary human observer, Abram was simply one more dusty, wandering herdsman, cautiously navigating territories controlled by military and political powers infinitely superior to his own. But when viewed from the vantage point of heaven, he functioned as a living, breathing boundary stone. Everywhere his foot touched the soil, the invisible God was quietly, imperceptibly, sketching a sacred circle on the geopolitical map. At Shechem, resting beneath the ancient, weighty terebinth trees, the voice returned with new clarity. To your yet unborn offspring, I solemnly pledge this land. Abram, whose physical possessions amounted to little more than temporary tents and livestock, received the staggering revelation that his future descendants would someday fully inherit the very ground beneath his sandals. His response was not one of shrewd negotiation or calculated doubt, but one of complete and immediate surrender. He built an altar right there, the rising smoke serving as a visual, fragile bridge spanning the vast gulf between the present reality and the monumental future assurance. This, crucially, is how the story of divine judgment truly commences, not originating with widespread sin, but rooted fundamentally in a singular, foundational promise. Before God elected to fully expose the deep-seated corruption of Sodom, he first solidified the transcendent calling of Abram. Before the sky itself ignited in devastating flames, an altar was meticulously set smoking in quiet submission. Before world-famous cities were destined to fall, an unbreakable covenant was gently whispered to an elderly wanderer and his infertile wife. Abram continued his journey, carefully pitching his dwelling between the ancient sites of Bethel and Ai, continually invoking the sacred name across a landscape ominously ringed by aggressive pagan shrines. With every utterance of that name, he issued a quiet, profound defiance against the prevailing gods of his era, publicly declaring that the trajectory of history belonged not to inert idols or transitory empires, but solely to the one who had spoken. For Abram, faith was never some abstract philosophical concept. It manifested as a long, arduous obedience maintained consistently in the same direction, demanding thousands of dusty, dedicated steps. Moreover, the promised blessing was never intended to be a private, insulating shield against personal hardship. The promise was designed to be outward-focused, explosive in scope, and fundamentally global. All families of the earth shall be blessed through you. This staggering mandate meant that the unfolding narrative of every nation, every gleaming city, every scattered people, even those currently racing headlong toward the visible darkness on the horizon, was already inextricably linked and brushing against the reality of Abram's pilgrimage. Far off, beyond the intervening hills, lay the glittering cities of the plain. They were utterly ignorant of his name, yet heaven was already meticulously weaving their imminent fate through the very fiber of his existence. Nonetheless, even the most powerful promises do not possess the power to instantly eradicate human weakness. A devastating famine ravaged the land, compelling Abram to descend into the fertile safety of Egypt simply to survive. Their fear, that perennial enemy, aggressively surfaced. He sought refuge behind a calculated half-truth, deceitfully introducing Sarai as his sister rather than his wife. The very man who initiated his journey with such profound bravery stumbled shamefully. Yet, the sovereign God who had issued the calling intervened nonetheless, preserving Sarai's honor and orchestrating Abram's return with even greater wealth than he possessed initially. Grace remained the steadfast companion of the promise, even at the moment when human courage entirely faltered. Upon Abram's eventual return to the promised land, to the hallowed location of his first altar, both he and Lot found themselves tremendously enriched, too affluent, in fact, to sustainably share the same finite pastures. The very soil separating their expansive encampments began to visibly strain under the overwhelming weight of their combined blessing. Herdsmen grew quarrelsome. The camps pressed against one another like volatile storm clouds gathering ominously before a break. The promise had exponentially multiplied their lives, but now that abundance necessitated a pivotal choice. Within the escalating tension between the revered uncle and the ambitious nephew, a diverging path quietly began to unfold. One distinct path offered a deeper immersion into the uncompromising demands of the life of faith. The other alluringly curved toward a glittering, low-lying valley, where Sodom lay waiting, beckoning like a deadly mirage shimmering in the heat. Even as they stood at the threshold of God's grand promise, the blessing continued its relentless growth. Flocks bred exponentially. Herds extended across the hillsides like undulating waves of shaggy wool and polished horn. Servants traveled in continuous lines between the vast tents. What had initially been a modest family caravan had swollen into two colossal encampments, Abram's and Lot's, both staggering beneath the sheer weight of their success. The very earth, which had once felt limitless and empty, now felt constricted and tight, as if the soil itself were emitting a low groan under the pressure of such disproportionate abundance. The devastating power that famine could not exert, prosperity began to successfully achieve. The rift began subtly. Hushed whispers exchanged among rival herdsmen, sharp, distrustful glances traded over vital water wells, and increasingly vehement arguments concerning grazing boundaries. Whose flock had established the claim first? Which segment of the land did whose goats possess the right to graze? Voices escalated into shouts. Hands angrily pointed accusatory fingers. Venerable loyalties quickly frayed and unraveled at the seams. Beneath the surface of every transactional dispute lay a quieter, profound truth. Their shared blessing had rendered the land too cramped for hearts that were rapidly diverging. The resident Canaanites and Perizzites still inhabited the region, closely observing the escalating tensions from a discreet distance. To these local inhabitants, Abram and Lot were not merely family members. They were visible representatives of this peculiar, invisible God who guided his people by extraordinary promises rather than conventional military treaties. Their internal conflict was therefore never a purely private affair. It registered as a glaring crack in the public testimony of the one whose name Abram so faithfully invoked. Abram recognized the danger. He could perceive the increasing tension, the sharp frictions echoing even in the silence of the night. He was undoubtedly older, perhaps physically slower, but his spiritual discernment remained entirely alert. This toxic environment was not the pilgrimage he had abandoned his home to pursue. The divine promise was absolutely not intended to transform kindred family into bitter, antagonistic rivals. So, He performed an act that was nearly incomprehensible within a world rigidly structured by principles of hierarchy and the sanctity of personal honor. He voluntarily relinquished his inherent right to prioritize his choice. "Please, let us have no ongoing strife between you and me, nor between your herdsmen and mine," he declared gently. "For we are blood relatives. Is not the entirety of this vast land open and available before you? I implore you, let us separate our paths. If you elect to go to the left hand, I will certainly proceed to the right. If you choose the right, then I shall willingly turn to the left." In the established structure of patriarchal culture, the elder brother or leader always commanded the privilege of choosing first, invariably claiming the superior portion. Yet, Abram consciously stepped aside, firmly placing the consequential power of decision directly into Lot's younger hands. This was not a demonstration of passive weakness. It was a resounding expression of confident faith. The stability of the promise, he understood, resided exclusively in the character of God, not in the superficial quality of the geography. Abram held an unwavering conviction that regardless of which physical portion Lot selected, God would remain absolutely faithful to his word. This critical juncture marks where the narrative tension tightens dramatically, resembling a bow string pulled back tautly to its breaking point. Lot lifted up his eyes. That brief, simple sentence conceals the frantic calculation of 1,000 heartbeats. He visually surveyed the entire expanse of the Jordan Plain, noting that it was lavishly watered throughout, glittering attractively under the midday sun. It appeared luxuriant, fertile, reminiscent of the pristine garden of the Lord itself, or perhaps the opulent, well-irrigated regions of Egypt he had recently traversed with his uncle. It was quite simply paradise for his trade. To the practical, earthbound eye of a seasoned herdsman, it was intensely green, deeply fertile, and brimming with observable life. He recognized raw opportunity. Crucially, he did not pause to consider what the unseen God might perceive. Not every shining surface is indicative of genuine blessing. Sometimes, a dazzling light is meticulously placed to guide you directly over a hidden precipice. Lot immediately and selfishly chose for himself the entire Jordan Plain. The biblical language is deliberately precise. He did not seek the sober counsel of Abram. He did not humbly inquire of the Lord. He chose exclusively for himself, operating solely guided by physical sight, abandoning the principle of faith. He began systematically moving his tent, step by methodical step, toward the notorious cities of the plain, specifically toward Sodom. The scriptural commentary is damning. The people of Sodom were flagrantly wicked, great sinners against the Lord. The local soil was indeed rich. The water sources were overwhelmingly plentiful. But the societal culture was rapidly decomposing from within. Lot registered only the superficial beauty. The veneer of prosperity completely concealed the deep, unseen fracture lines running beneath the surface. In the course of every human life, we inevitably confront choices that bear the precise characteristics of Lot's pivotal decision. Paths that initially appear beautiful, offer effortless advantage, but conceal a grave danger, glittering brilliantly at their commencement only to darken irrevocably toward their conclusion. If you, the listener, have ever trod upon such a deceptive path, or perhaps managed to turn away from one just in the nick of time, understand that your personal history is far from trivial. We urge you to share your experience, not as mere gossip or boastful anecdote, but as profound testimony. By doing so, this digital space transcends being simply a screen and transforms into a vigilant circle of watchmen, establishing a community prepared to pray, to carefully deliberate, and to collectively tremble in sincere reverence before the authoritative word of God. Abram stood silently, watching Lot's vast caravan retreat toward the distant horizon, the younger man leaving only plumes of dust and increasing distance in his wake. To any casual human observer, the scene must have appeared as a clear defeat for Abram. The old patriarch had magnanimously conceded the most promising, fertile land to his ambitious nephew and seemingly resigned himself to the difficult, less desirable hill country. But heaven's accounting system operates on entirely different principles than man's. Immediately after Lot's departure, the divine voice returned to Abram, delivering not a word of rebuke for his apparent loss, but a stunning revelation. Lift up your eyes now and look carefully from the very place where you stand. Stretch your gaze northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the immense land that your eyes behold, I will bestow it upon you and upon your descendants for an everlasting possession. Where Lot had aggressively lifted his eyes guided by selfish calculation and material desire, Abram was now commanded to lift his eyes directed by boundless faith. God did not merely reiterate the promise. He expansively magnified it. I will multiply your future offspring until they are as innumerable as the dust of the earth. The man who still possessed no heir was instructed to visualize an uncountable progeny stretching into the future. It must be noted, the Almighty God was neither threatened nor diminished by Lot's greedy, self-serving choice, nor was he in any way limited by the physical geography of the region. In the transcendent economy of heaven, what presents itself as a substantial material loss, undertaken for the sake of integrity and peace, invariably becomes the open doorway to immeasurably deeper blessing. Abram responded instinctively, in the only manner his heart recognized. He moved onward. He constructed yet another altar. He invoked the sacred name once more. While Lot steadily drew nearer to the dazzling, seductive corruption of permanent city life within Sodom, Abram intentionally anchored his life's narrative in steadfast worship upon lonely, elevated heights. Here were two men, two radically divergent paths, two entirely different modes of sight. One man saw only with his physical eye and willingly strode into a profound danger cleverly disguised as worldly comfort. The other trusted the unseen and deliberately walked into voluntary obscurity, finding his security completely enveloped by the promise. And far below them, along the heat-shimmering plain, where the Jordan River snaked its way like a gleaming silver serpent, the formidable cities of the valley glittered and openly scorned them, entirely oblivious that a final line of demarcation had already been inscribed above them, not by the actions of Abram, nor by the choices of Lot, but by the eternal God who perceives beyond the mere limits of the physical horizon. Lot's decision was significantly more consequential than a simple change of address. It constituted Sodom's very first step directly into the core narrative of coming judgment. In the subsequent movement of this account, we shall descend directly into that valley, sense its insidious seduction firsthand, and observe as extraordinary beauty, overwhelming power, and pervasive violence fuse into a singular, decadent culture hurtling at reckless speed toward its fiery conclusion. Lot descended into the plain like a person stepping completely into a mesmerizing, sensory dream. The Jordan plain unfurled before him, brilliantly shimmering with countless rivers and meticulously engineered canals, covered in lush vineyards, expansive orchards, and fields bowed low under the weight of ripening grain. For a society still bearing the psychological scars of recent famine, this location appeared nothing less than a second, achievable Eden. The topsoil was deep, dark, and extraordinarily rich. Tall palm trees swayed with a gentle, hypnotic rhythm in the cooling evening breeze. Water, the undisputed, most precious currency of the entire ancient world, did not merely exist. It flowed in ostentatious, undeniable abundance. If the entirety of Abram's existence was defined by the simplicity of tents and dedicated altars, the world of Sodom was fiercely dominated by impregnable walls and bustling, complex markets. Massive stone towers maintained a perpetual, watchful vigil over the roads. The great city gates served as the frame for the continuous influx of wealthy merchants, hardened soldiers, captivating entertainers, and ambitious travelers arriving from the most distant known lands. Caravans arriving from both the remote east and the far west converged here, exchanging exotic spices, valuable metals, bolts of brightly dyed cloth, and intoxicating tales of powerful, faraway kings. Wealth did not cautiously trickle into Sodom. It arrived with the undeniable, overwhelming force of a crashing tidal wave. Within the city's heart, this relentless prosperity dictated and authored its own self-congratulatory liturgy. The streets perpetually pulsed with intoxicating music, illuminated by lamps suspended high overhead, aggressively pushing back the natural darkness of the night, fueled by a collective, sustained laughter that echoed long after the sun had fully set. Lavish banquets were hosted nightly in residences boasting highly polished stone floors, where tables literally groaned beneath the tremendous weight of sumptuous food. Expensive oil flowed freely, wine constantly sparkled, and the vocabulary of unbridled success was the only language spoken fluently. If judgment were made purely based on external appearances, the verdict would be immediate. Surely this city is supremely blessed. The plain never presented as cursed. It looked manifestly chosen. Yet, the sacred scripture eventually pulls back this deceptive curtain. Centuries later, a prophet would definitively diagnose Sodom's true, deep-seated disease. Overweening pride stemming from sheer abundance, combined with an utter, callous unconcern for the city's marginalized poor. They possessed far more than was necessary, yet they resolutely refused to lift or strengthen the weakened hand of the needy. This is the genuine shock. The primary sin of Sodom is not presented as some obscure, hidden secret vice practiced in the shadows. It was conspicuously public. It was deeply systemic. It was the active, conscious decision to indulge in continuous feasting while deliberately ignoring the human beings visibly starving just outside the city's gate. Across the entire ancient Near East, the practice of hospitality was never a mere suggestion of civility. It was recognized as a sacred, fundamental duty. To graciously welcome the exhausted stranger and to actively protect the vulnerable traveler was held up as a profound act of righteousness, believed to reflect the very essence of the divine heart. A city's ultimate moral standing was judged by the manner in which it treated those utterly devoid of power. The physical doorway of a home acted as a spiritual border. Once a guest crossed that threshold, their very life was placed automatically under the host's sacred protection. In Sodom, that foundational doorway was catastrophically fracturing. We can easily visualize Lot's initial, compelling impressions. The reassuring security provided by towering stone walls replacing the vulnerability of the open desert. The effortless convenience of centralized markets replacing the hardship of wandering pastures. The exhilarating thrill of existing at the dynamic center where all important things happened. But subtly, inexorably, the toxic moral structure of the city began to imprint itself onto the very soul of his family. The dominant voices heard near the city gate spoke only of ruthless control, never of compassionate care. The powerful elite treated matters of justice like frivolous toys and regarded the citizenry like interchangeable, exploitable resources. Justice, consequently, became a commodity to be bought and sold. Mercy was summarily silenced. The poor were forced to wait in the lengthening shadows of tables, perpetually overflowing with abundance. Widows, orphans, foreign residents, and daily laborers watched helplessly as heavy carts piled high with grain rolled past them, destined for the locked storerooms they would never be permitted to enter. Those few who possessed influence wielded it mercilessly to climb to even greater heights, while those beneath them quickly learned the survival strategy of keeping their heads lowered and their mouths shut. Poverty was certainly present, yet it had been rendered structurally invisible by deliberate design. That which had once been celebrated as a virtue instantly transformed into an object of cruel humor. Hospitality, formerly held in high esteem, was dismissed as sheer weakness. Generosity was mocked as terminal naivety. True compassion was strictly rationed, reserved exclusively for those securely inside the inner circle of power, and never extended to those standing vulnerably outside the gate. There exists a profoundly chilling moment in the life cycle of every culture when the sharp tool of ridicule is aggressively mobilized as a weapon against righteousness. Sodom had arrived at that critical juncture and sprinted recklessly past it. Within the city's boundaries, all previous virtues were now openly held up to scornful laughter, and those behaviors that were once considered deeply shameful had been proudly elevated to the new, accepted social standard. The city had not merely shifted its moral compass. It had fully inverted it, and it wore the resulting new direction as a badge of honor. Prophets would subsequently describe Sodom's defining quality as haughtiness. This term implies far more than simple outward arrogance of posture. It speaks directly to a profoundly hardened spiritual heart that had ceased entirely to tremble in the face of injustice, and had lost the capacity to blush with shame at the most egregious cruelty. Sodom's terminal sin was its ability to grow entirely comfortable with moral realities that should have utterly broken its collective soul. Day after ordinary day, the cycle of aggressive commerce continued without interruption. People conducted their business, married, and were given in marriage. They meticulously planned their investments, built new infrastructure, sang their triumphant songs, and celebrated their material gains. Seen from the exterior, the city radiated phenomenal success. Internally, however, something profoundly vital was rapidly expiring. When the reverent fear of God is systematically expunged from a culture, the necessary fear of consequences quickly dissipates thereafter. Once a society successfully convinces itself that no ultimate metaphysical authority will ever hold it accountable, it ceases asking if its choices are morally right, concerning itself only with whether they are financially profitable. There resides a formidable mystery within God's extensive patience. He does not execute a swift strike upon the first injustice, nor even upon the 100th. Judgment rarely descends with the speed that human expectation demands. This deliberate, slow delay is commonly misinterpreted by the wicked as divine approval or, worse, divine absence. In Sodom, the prolonged lack of immediate negative consequences was implicitly received as blanket permission to plunge even deeper into moral degradation. Yet, the immutable ground remembers the history etched upon it. Heaven maintains a precise record. Every disregarded cry, every life ruthlessly crushed, every instance of goodness cynically mocked, inscribes another definitive line in a cosmic ledger that remains hidden from human sight. The plain still maintained the outward appearance of Eden, but that original garden had been vigilantly guarded by a terrifying flaming sword. Sodom possessed no such protective barrier. Its inhabitants walked unchecked into moral territories from which their souls would likely never be able to retreat. Lot, positioned squarely in the center of this decay, emerges as a profoundly tragic figure. The New Testament writers would centuries later acknowledge him as righteous, describing how his upright soul was continually tormented by the relentless spectacle of their lawless deeds. He even held a position of authority, sitting in the city gate, the center of local governance. Yet, he was trapped, residing in a city whose inverted values were slowly consuming and burning his spirit from the inside out. Lot serves as stark proof that one can be genuinely grieved and appalled by the surrounding culture and simultaneously remain fatally entangled within it, that one can clearly perceive the encroaching darkness and yet still lack the resolve to depart. The physical beauty and material allure of Sodom were undeniably real. However, the moral danger of Sodom was infinitely deeper. The problem was not merely that the city habitually performed evil acts. It was that the city had successfully redefined evil as perfectly normal, overtly celebrated, and functionally safe. When any community deliberately crosses that existential line, it does not merely risk the possibility of judgment. It begins actively summoning it. And so, beneath the superficial noise of endless laughter and song, beneath the rhythmic clinking of ornate cups and the methodical counting of freshly minted coins, a far more significant sound was gradually rising, a terrifying resonance that no one in Sodom possessed the spiritual ears to perceive. It was the accumulating weight of divine concern, the intensifying gravity of a sovereign God who categorically refuses to ignore the cries of the marginalized and oppressed forever. While the people of Sodom continued their fearless, indulgent feasting, far away on a quiet, sun-drenched hillside, a profoundly different kind of feast was being meticulously prepared. An aging patriarch was earnestly arranging a simple meal for 3 enigmatic, mysterious visitors, completely unaware that the singular conversation about to unfold within his modest tent would ultimately seal the fate of an entire valley. The day had commenced like countless others. The relentless sun slowly climbed over the rugged ridges of Canaan, steadily pouring its oppressive heat over Abram's tents and scattered flocks. Servants navigated their familiar routes between the necessary tasks of tending animals and drawing water from the deep wells. Fine, familiar dust rose lazily in thin clouds. It was the predictable, ordinary rhythm of a committed, wandering life. Then, Abram instinctively lifted his gaze. 3 men stood silently nearby, not heralded by a noisy caravan or announced by a formal guard. They were simply present. They were clearly within the range of human sight, yet they carried an unshakable presence that suggested they were somehow far more significant than mere men. There were no accompanying trumpets, no dramatic celestial thunder, only 3 figures arriving during the most oppressive heat of the day, when any sensible traveler would be seeking deep shade, not extending their journey. Abram immediately broke custom and ran to meet them. This frantic haste serves as the first undeniable indicator that this encounter was extraordinary. Esteemed patriarchs typically do not run, especially not toward unidentified strangers. Yet, he bowed profoundly low and urgently implored them to remain. "Please, my lords, I beg you, do not pass your servant by. Allow a little water to be fetched. Rest yourselves fully beneath the shelter of the tree. I will quickly prepare and bring a mere morsel of bread, so that you may refresh your strength." That promised morsel swiftly escalated into a magnificent feast. The very finest flour was rapidly requisitioned. A choice, tender young calf was selected and prepared. Rich curd and fresh milk were generously placed before them. In a cultural context where hospitality was rigorously observed as a sacred duty, Abram voluntarily exceeded the demand of mere duty. He did not fully know, though perhaps he possessed a dim, powerful sensing, that he was entertaining not just ordinary men, but beings of heavenly magnitude. They partook. The realm of heaven was sharing a communal meal inside a mortal man's tent. Then, from the leader of the three, came a question that cut through the long, fruitless years like a sharp blade. "Where is Sarah, your wife?" They did not use her old name, Sarai. They spoke her new, covenantal name, the name of promise itself. Abram responded simply, "She is safely inside the tent." And then came the definitive, world-altering word, a declaration that defied every known law of human biology and expectation. "I will surely return to you precisely about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall definitively bear a son." Sarah, the barren wife, was positioned just inside, listening intently behind the tent's woven fabric, the thin, permeable wall separating her long-held doubt from the shocking, audacious reality of the promise itself. Hope and despair. She knew her age, marking the long decline of fertility. She knew her body, a temple now hollowed by time and unfulfilled yearning. She knew the years of waiting that had settled not merely as disappointment, but like cold, heavy stones in her chest, pressing the breath out of her hope. She laughed, a sound not of brazen mockery aimed outward, but rather a sharp, brittle echo deep inside her heart. A sound of self-derision and tired cynicism. "After I am worn out, and my Lord is old, shall I finally have pleasure?" The question carried the scent of impossibility. But the divine visitor, whose hearing pierced the silence of the soul, heard that hidden, unspoken laughter. "Why did Sarah laugh?" he asked. "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" It was not a severe cross-examination, but a gentle, staggering revelation. The God of the covenant was not bound by human biological clocks, nor limited by the wombs of women or the turning of calendars. Sarah's secret, fragile doubt was tenderly drawn into the light, not to embarrass her, but to demonstrate that even her deepest skepticism fell within the boundless reach of grace. A child would indeed come. The brittle sound of doubt would one day return as robust, unstoppable joy. The saga of promise deepened, rooted now in the soil of miraculous possibility. But even as the future of this single family was secured in that moment, the fate of an entire region was rapidly hurtling toward its own terrible crisis. The heavenly men rose from their meal to depart. From the high vantage point where Abram walked with them, they looked eastward toward the valley, and the city of Sodom lay below, lush, tempting, shimmering in the distant heat like a beautiful but deceptive mirage. The narrative slows here, intentionally, as if heaven itself pauses, breathing in the quiet before the storm. "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do?" The Lord says. He recalls his foundational promise, that Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and that through his descendants all nations of the earth shall ultimately be blessed. A nation called to bless the world must first grasp the terrible cost of pervasive corruption. A man called to intercede for humanity must be invited into the painful burden of divine judgment. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, the Lord declares, and their sin is very grave. "I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know." The language chosen is precise and deliberate. Outcry, sa'aka, is a word reserved in Scripture for the agonizing screams of the oppressed, the desperate cries of victims who possess no earthly defender or advocate. Sodom's transgression was far more than private immorality. It was public violence. It was a systemic, entrenched injustice that had risen and reached the ears of the highest heaven. 2 of the men turned and began their descent toward the opulent but doomed city of Sodom. But Abraham remained, standing in awe and vulnerability before the Lord. This moment is one of the most audacious, gut-wrenching scenes in all of Scripture. A man fashioned from common dust stands before the judge of all the earth and opens his mouth, not to argue his own case, but to plead for the lives of an entire city filled with strangers. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? He asks, the tremor of fear mixed with conviction in his voice. Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep the place and not spare it for the sake of the 50 righteous who are in it? His words dance precariously between profound boldness and utter humility. Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? He is not hurling an accusation at God. He is appealing directly to the flawless, righteous character of God himself. Justice and mercy collide, fusing into a desperate, focused plea, and heaven answers with astonishing grace. If I find in Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. The agonizing negotiation continues, dropping 45, 40, 30, 20. With each reduction, Abraham pauses, recentering himself in his smallness. Indeed now, I who am but dust and ashes have taken it upon myself to speak to the Lord. Yet he presses on, driven by a nameless compassion. He is not haggling for profit or land. He is wrestling for the lives of people he will never even meet, for the souls whose names he does not know. At last, he reaches the absolute lowest number his courage can bear. Suppose 10 are found there. I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. If only 10 hearts were still marginally aligned with God's goodness, the entire metropolis would be given the gift of another sunrise. At this point, we must pause and take a breath. Somewhere in your own world, there exists a city, a community, or a family walking blindly along the edge of a spiritual cliff. Comfortable, perhaps materially successful, but critically distant from the heart of God. Allow their name, or even just their initial, to rise quietly and weightily in your mind. If you feel compelled, write it down. Not as a display to impress anyone, but as a small, silent, sincere act of intercession, mirroring the patriarch. Here, in this shared sacred space, we remember that Abraham's ministry of standing in the gap is not a completed relic of the past. It continues in every heart that dares to stand before the judge on behalf of others. The Lord went his way, his immediate purpose accomplished. Abraham returned to his place, the tension of the outcome hanging heavy in the air. The dialogue ended, but the existential suspense did not. We are left with a haunting, terrible question that echoes across millennia. Are there even 10? As the sun sank, hemorrhaging color, and night gathered over the valley, those 2 remaining visitors drew closer to the fortress-like gates of Sodom. In the next movement of the story, they will step into the city's streets, and the profound, festering wickedness that has been concealed behind its bright, successful walls will finally be revealed for the judgment it deserves. Evening settled over the plain like a heavy velvet cloak. Lamps were being lit in the houses, doors were closing on commerce, and the city of Sodom was preparing for another long night of self-indulgent pleasure. At that precise hour, 2 figures approached the main gate. They were quiet, utterly ordinary to the untrained earthly eye, yet they carried the immense authority of another world, of the king's court. They were not merchants seeking gain, not soldiers enforcing rule, and certainly not beggars seeking charity. They were messengers, angels in human form, walking straight into the vibrant, beating heart of a metropolis that was terrifyingly unaware it was standing trial. Lot was sitting in the gate. The gate of an ancient city was its true nerve center, the municipal court where elders judged disputes, the exchange where lucrative deals were brokered, the visible stage where status and power were proudly displayed. Lot, the once wandering shepherd, had risen significantly in stature to become a city official, or at least a highly respected resident. He was no longer just Abram's nephew. He was Lot of Sodom, a man with a guaranteed seat at the table of influence. When he spotted the two strangers, something deep within him flared to life. A faint, ancient memory of a different, more righteous way, a simpler tent, and a different man named Abram. He rose instantly to meet them, bowed low with his face to the earth in the posture of profound respect, and urgently pressed them. "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night. Wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way." At first, they politely refused, adhering to common practice. "No, we will spend the night in the town square." That arrangement would have been perfectly normal in safer, more virtuous places where genuine hospitality was a widespread social virtue. But Lot knew Sodom too intimately, too well. The darkened streets were a territory hostile and unsafe for the unprotected traveler. The city's superficial beauty ended sharply at sundown. He pressed them strongly, repeatedly, until they finally agreed. They entered his house. Bread was baked quickly, without yeast, signifying urgency. A simple meal was formed almost instantly, and they ate together. For one fleeting moment, the sacred, old world of radical covenant hospitality flickered back to life inside Sodom, represented by a single household practicing the ancient virtue the entire surrounding culture had long forgotten and despised. Then came the knock. It began quietly, as a low murmur outside the door, a distinct rustle of many feet, the deep, low rumble of many voices gathering quickly. Soon, it escalated into a deafening, violent pounding. The men of the city, encompassing both the young and the old, arriving from every single quarter of the town, surrounded the house entirely. This was no mere small group of drunken troublemakers. This was the concentrated wrath of the city itself, a populace united in malice. "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" they screamed. "Bring them out to us, that we may know them." Their demand was scarcely veiled. They intended not simple welcome but extreme humiliation, not the provision of hospitality but calculated abuse. In all ancient cultures, to violate a guest under one's roof was the ultimate, horrifying inversion of righteousness, a public declaration that raw power, not morality or divine law, governed the city gate. When a society begins to systematically call evil good and cloak violence in the sophisticated language of desire or entitlement, the day of inescapable judgment is terrifyingly near. Lot stepped outside and, in a desperate, lonely act, shut the door behind him, placing his own body between the mob and his guests. The image is agonizingly stark. One single man standing against a violent crowd, desperately attempting to protect the sanctity of the guests under his roof. But Sodom had already twisted his basic understanding of right and wrong. In his frenzy to protect his visitors, he offered something utterly unthinkable, something that violated all codes. His own virgin daughters, as if their destruction would be preferable to violating the supreme, sacred code of hospitality. Lot's conscience was still somehow tenuously alive, but it was horrifyingly deformed and misshapen by the decadent values of the city he had chosen to make his home. He knew what was right, yet tried desperately to defend it using methods birthed entirely in spiritual darkness. Sodom had failed to silence his spirit completely, but it had succeeded in thoroughly confusing him. The crowd pressed closer, their faces distorted in mocking rage. They ridiculed Lot's frantic, weak attempt at moral authority. "This fellow came here merely to sojourn, and now he has the arrogance to become the judge." In their eyes, any protest against their immediate, base desires was the highest form of oppression and arrogance. The roles had terrifyingly reversed. Righteousness was framed as arbitrary prohibition. Wickedness audaciously claimed the language of freedom and self-expression. They advanced, straining to break the heavy wooden door. At that precise moment, the strangers inside proved they were strangers no more. The men reached out, pulling Lot back into the house, and shut the door with terrible finality. Then, with supernatural power, they struck the entire mob outside with blinding light. Those who had prided themselves on seeing everything, experiencing everything, suddenly stumbled in the absolute dark, groaning, groping blindly for a door they could no longer locate. Their sudden physical blindness was a perfect mirror for the moral blindness that had ruled their collective spirit for years. While the frustrated crowd outside wore themselves out in confusing futility, the angels inside turned to Lot with a question that sliced cleanly through the noise and chaos. "Have you anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of this place. For we are about to destroy this place because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." The verdict had been spoken. Sodom's sentence was not a sudden, capricious outburst. It was the solemn, inevitable culmination of years of ignored warning signs, decades of silenced cries, and generations of pervasive, unrepented sin. What later prophets would fiercely condemn was now being answered in a thunderclap of action. The angels were not executing the judgment driven by passionate rage. They were the precise instruments of a justice that had patiently listened and watched far longer than the guilty city had ever deserved. Lot hurried back out to speak to the men pledged to marry his daughters. His words tumbled forward in urgent, panicked bursts. "Get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But to them, secure in their metropolitan arrogance, he seemed to be merely jesting, indulging in some kind of superstitious frenzy. Judgment sounded utterly ridiculous, a colossal joke, to ears that had grown up entirely insulated in the self-sufficiency of Sodom. The very idea that their magnificent, permanent world could end overnight seemed absurd, an unrealistic religious panic. So many people in so many comfortable ages still think that exact way. The night deepened, yet the city offered no rest. Inside the small house, the unbearable weight of what had been revealed pressed down upon Lot and his family like a devastating storm about to break. Outside, a city staggered blindly in its self-inflicted confusion, utterly unaware that its last sunrise was only hours away. As dawn began its slow, inevitable touch upon the horizon, we will witness how excruciatingly difficult it is to leave a doomed world behind. And we will see how far heaven is truly willing to go to drag a reluctant, attached heart into salvation. Night in Sodom had never felt so painfully long. Inside Lot's hastily secured house, sleep was impossible. The grave words of the angels hung in the thick air like thunder yet to break. "We are about to destroy this place." Outside, the city attempted to force a return to its routine, licking its wounds from the strange, terrifying blindness, explaining it away with rationalizations, or laughing it off as a collective hallucination. But something fundamental in the atmosphere had changed. The unseen clock of ultimate judgment was silently ticking toward zero. Lot had gone to his sons-in-law with raw urgency in his voice. "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But to them, he sounded like a man telling frantic ghost stories around a dying fire. They simply laughed. To men born and securely raised in Sodom, the notion that their stone-walled, commercially vibrant world could end overnight was absurd, bordering on insulting. Stone walls felt eternal. Markets felt permanent. Divine judgment felt like a primitive, religious exaggeration only suitable for the ignorant. Unbelief always has the perverse power to make the cliff look flat. As the first pale, hesitant line of dawn began to draw itself across the horizon, the angels moved with decisive authority. There would be no further debates, no more drawn-out warnings. "Up," they commanded Lot, the word ringing with finality. "Take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." And then the most human, agonizing line in the entire story appears. But he lingered. Lot lingered. Destruction was merely moments away. Angels were standing ready in his house. The warning was still ringing in his ears like a clanging bell. Yet he hesitated. The inexorable pull of a life painstakingly built in Sodom. The years, the memories, the comfort of routine, the deep-seated relationships. All of it wrapped like invisible, suffocating chains around his feet. Judgment was frighteningly real, but so was attachment. How many souls across history have been lost? Not because they never heard the truth, but because they waited too long, too hesitantly to make the move. The angels did not argue further, nor did they waste time pleading. Compassion and urgency instantly fused into resolute action. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him. Lot did not march out of Sodom as a hero, having made a difficult but firm decision. He was dragged out forcefully as a passive recipient of rescue. Salvation in that immediate life-or-death moment was not a reward for his spiritual strength or his clear-headed choice. It was an act of sheer, radical mercy, rooted not in Lot's inherent worthiness, but in God's unwavering remembrance of Abraham and his own covenant promise. Sometimes, grace looks exactly like a strong hand grabbing you when every fiber of your being would rather stay behind. They brought them out and firmly set them outside the city walls. Then came the command, clear, uncompromising, and spiritually surgical. Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. This was not merely physical instruction for travel. It was spiritual surgery. Do not look back. Do not attempt to stay halfway. Do not live with your soul constantly facing what God is actively leaving behind. Lot, still negotiating even with his own survival, answered, "Oh no, my lords." He acknowledged the profound kindness shown to him, yet immediately pleaded for a dangerous modification. "I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, that city there is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved?" He was asking to trade the mountains of absolute separation for a small, compromised sanctuary. A tiny city named Zor, meaning little. The Lord, in astonishing patience, granted it. "Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there." Even in the midst of impending judgment, there was divine accommodation. Even as the fire gathered in the heavens, mercy waited. God could do nothing until Lot was securely safe. Sometimes the one thing that saves your life is simply learning to leave in time. Not when you feel emotionally ready, not when every loose end is neatly tied, but when God's voice says, "Go." If you have ever lived through such a terrifying dawn, when you had to walk away from something familiar, cherished but corrupting in order to preserve your soul, when you had to leave behind a destructive pattern, a toxic place, or a relationship that was killing you quietly, then you know the staggering cost and the dizzying relief. If you feel led, share a glimpse of that journey. Your few words might become the spiritual rope someone else clings to in their own escaping night. As the small, traumatized family hurried towards Zor, the plain behind them still slumbered, deceptively quiet. No sirens blared, no alarms were sounded. The world often looks most peaceful just before the ultimate breaking point. The command, "Do not look back," was never an act of cruelty. It was the highest form of protection. Looking back would signify more than merely turning the head. It would mean turning the heart, anchoring the soul in the very thing God was about to irrevocably burn away. Lot's wife walked along that thin, razor-sharp line between the past and the future. Her physical body moved forward, but her true heart did not. In a few terrifying verses, she will become the most haunting, silent monument in the entire valley, a tragic pillar testifying to the lethal danger of a divided soul. For now the sun climbs higher. Lot reaches the little city, and only when the last reluctant refugee has crossed the threshold of mercy does heaven begin to open its terrible furnace over the land they have left behind. The sky was still pale with the light of the new day when Lot stumbled into Zor. To the oblivious people of that little city, he must have looked like any other desperate, dust-covered refugee. Dust clung to his clothes, fear was stark in his eyes, and a small, terrified family trailed behind him. The world, from their localized vantage point, was utterly unchanged. Birds circled lazily. The breeze moved gently across the plain. Fields waited patiently for harvest. But an invisible line had been crossed, a boundary no human eye could perceive. The last word of warning had been spoken. The last chance for repentance had been given. The last hesitant footstep of mercy had crossed into safety. Then it began. Scripture says, with terrifying simplicity, that the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from out of heaven. Not from volcanic eruptions below, not from invading armies from the north, but from above, from the very realm the city had mocked and dismissed as irrelevant fantasy. What they smugly believed could never touch them became the very thing that instantly unmade them. The plain, which had shimmered so alluringly like a second Garden of Eden, suddenly burned like a devastating industrial furnace. The air, once fragrant with the scent of vines and grain, was instantly filled with the acrid, metallic bite of sulfur. What had been a river of lush life turned suddenly into a mirror of absolute horror, reflecting the towering flames devouring the valley. Houses, bustling markets, profane temples, sophisticated streets. Everything that had felt so permanent and strong melted and collapsed into a desolate, ruined landscape. We are not given the grotesque details of every cry, every frantic attempt at escape. The text is mercifully sparse. The essential point is not to satisfy our morbid human curiosity, but to force our hearts to confront a stark, undeniable truth, that a culture can indeed cross a spiritual line where the God who is patient beyond human imagination finally and necessarily acts in justice. This was not an unpredictable outburst of divine rage. It was a sober, weighty verdict delivered only after a long, exhaustive trial. The collected outcry of countless victims, the sheer weight of unrepented cruelty, the towering arrogance of a city that systematically laughed at goodness, these had all risen like thick, black smoke to heaven. Now smoke rose from the earth to provide the terrible answer. Somewhere on the short, terrified path between Sodom and Zor, another, more intimate drama was tragically taking place. One no less devastating in its consequence. Lot's wife had successfully left the city with her body, but she had failed to bring her heart. Each step away from Sodom was a tearing of the soul. Her home, her deeply cherished friends, her memories, the comfortable, familiar rhythms of her entire life. All of it lay behind her, now rapidly wrapped in flames she could not bear to imagine. The commandment, "Do not look back," pulsed in the air like a high-voltage current. But commandments do not instantly erase deep-seated attachment. They merely reveal it. She looked back. In that single backward glance, we see far more than simple curiosity. We see profound, agonizing longing. The original word suggests a sustained turning, a desperate, fixed adherence of the gaze. Her eyes clung to the place God was currently judging, as if she could not possibly conceive of a future without it. Her body faced salvation, but her heart continued to worship what was being violently destroyed, and she became a pillar of salt. There was no thunder, no lightning, no dialogue, just a sudden, terrible stillness. The woman who could not let go of the past instantly became a monumental witness to what it means to be permanently frozen between two entirely separate worlds. She was no longer a part of Sodom, yet she was not fully counted among the rescued. Her life was tragically turned into a potent, silent warning that would echo through centuries, all the way to the lips of Christ himself. Remember Lot's wife. There are some looks back at the past that accomplish far more than stirring nostalgia. They calcify us. They harden us in the very places God is urgently calling us to leave behind forever. There are tears we shed not because we truly grieve our sin, but because we desperately miss it. Sometimes, a single, sustained look at what God is judging is tragically enough to freeze your future in its tracks. The entire region around the Dead Sea still bears scars that some scholars and archaeologists link, at least symbolically, to this catastrophe. Massive fields of salt, strange mineral formations, and unmistakable layers of destruction buried deep in the earth testify to the ancient violence. Whether or not we can pinpoint the exact crater of Sodom, the enduring narrative insists on this truth. What looked utterly unshakable was reduced to indiscriminate ash. The Bible speaks of God overthrowing those cities, using the same powerful verb later employed for national defeats and sudden collapses. Sodom became the defining template, the dark benchmark by which all later judgments would be soberly measured. The lush plain was violently turned into a desolate, dead basin. The other cities of the valley, Admah, Zeboim, the silent neighbors of Sodom and Gomorrah, were swept into the same terrible fate. Sin is rarely solitary. It forms alliances, networks, and communities. Judgment, when it finally comes, often sweeps through these networks, not just through isolated individuals. In Zor, Lot must have felt the very ground tremble, seen the entire sky lit with unnatural, apocalyptic flame, and heard the distant, dreadful roar. He had escaped, but at a terrible, agonizing cost. His wife was gone. His future was terrifyingly uncertain. Behind him, an entire valley was erased. Before him, a life that would never again feel secure in the comforting shadow of cities. The trauma of that devastating morning would linger and fester in his daughters' minds, shaping choices yet to come. Judgment always has aftershocks, not only for those who perish, but for those who manage to survive. Survival does not automatically translate into instantaneous healing. And yet, somewhere else entirely, another pair of eyes was watching that same horrifying smoke. High on a distant ridge, Abraham rose early in the morning and went quickly to the place where he had stood before the Lord in negotiation. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the vast land of the plain, and saw in the terrifying distance the smoke of the land going up like the thick smoke of a furnace. The man who had desperately pleaded for a dozen righteous souls now silently watched the valley burn down to nothing. In that profound, silent moment, standing between the weight of promise and the severity of judgment, Abraham learned a necessary truth that would shape his descendants forever. That the God who makes binding, unconditional covenants is also the God who keeps precise, detailed accounts, and that his mercy and his holiness are not rivals but two edges of the same blazing reality. In the next part, we will stand beside Abraham on that hillside and see how the sight of a destroyed valley and a rescued nephew reveals the deepest tension and the deepest hope at the heart of biblical faith. Morning came quietly, as if the world itself were unaware of the catastrophic verdict that had been carried out in the dark hours. The sun climbed over the hills of Canaan, touching tents and rough stones with the same gentle, indifferent light it had shone the day before. The calm was deceptive, but not all mornings are the same. Some mornings carry the inescapable weight of terrible endings. Abraham rose early, driven by an unsettled spirit and the memory of the sleepless night. He walked with purposeful steps to the very place where he had stood before the Lord, a sacred patch of earth now charged with lingering spiritual tension. This was the spot where he had dared to haggle with the Almighty, asking if 50, then 45, 40, 30, 20, 10 righteous people might be enough to stay the hand of judgment and save a doomed city. The memory of that earnest, audacious conversation still hung in the cool morning air like a faint, unanswered echo. Dust crunched under his sandals as he approached the edge of the ridge, the point offering the widest view south. He looked out across the plain, his eyes searching the horizon. Then he saw it, far in the distance, where the lush, vibrant green of the Jordan plain had once stretched like a ribbon of life, promising prosperity and ease. Something darker was rising. Smoke. It was not the thin, blue wisp of a cooking fire. This was thick, heavy, climbing upward like the breath of a colossal, endless furnace, a geological event of sheer devastation. It did not move like morning mist or gentle fog. It boiled, it coiled, it roiled, a visible, undeniable column of judgment, pressing its terrible reality into the vast, indifferent sky. The valley of Sodom and Gomorrah was gone. Scripture is stark in its observation. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. A place that had been described as a picture of paradise, like the garden of the Lord, now looked like the mouth of an open kiln, a massive, smoldering scar upon the earth. Abraham had lived long enough to witness wars, to see settlements destroyed and cities burned by human hands. This was fundamentally different. This was the visible aftermath of a divine verdict, a fire that answered not to an army's malice, but to heaven's justice. His heart must have clenched in a vice grip of agonizing questions. Were there 10? Had he been too timid? Had he ceased his intercession one step too soon? Could he have gone lower 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10? Why not 5? Why not just one righteous man? The Bible does not record Abraham's words here. It records only his silent, agonizing gaze. Sometimes, in the face of overwhelming reality, silence is the most honest prayer, the only fit response to a mystery too vast for articulation. From that devastating vantage point, the mystery of God's dual character pressed in on him with crushing weight. The gentle God who had promised a son to barren Sarah was the very same Holy One who had just overturned an entire civilization. The one who had walked as a humble guest under Abraham's tree now stood revealed as the eternal judge over the valley. These are not two different gods vying for control. This is the same Holy One revealing two different facets of his perfection in two different moments. The justice of God is not the opposite of his mercy, but the essential prerequisite for it. It is the action taken when everything must be put back into its proper moral order. For years, Sodom's systemic injustice had gone unanswered. The cries of the oppressed and the powerless had risen like unheard incense, day after day, without reply. To the victims, the slaves, the exploited, it must have seemed as if heaven was utterly deaf and absent. But on this morning, Abraham saw with terrifying clarity that God had not forgotten a single cry, a single injustice. He had been slow to anger, yes, but crucially, he had not been absent from the moral equation. Patience is not indifference, nor is slowness to act a denial of action. Delayed judgment is never a denial of ultimate judgment. And yet, even amidst the thick, choking smoke, mercy was undeniably present. The text says that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, he remembered Abraham and, for his sake, sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow. Lot was not saved because he suddenly became heroic or because he was consistently righteous in his dealings. He was saved because someone else had stood before God for him, stepping into the gap he himself was too compromised to fill. Abraham's intercession did not prevent the destruction of Sodom, which was necessary for justice, but it did open a vital corridor of mercy for one flawed man and his immediate family. This is intercession in its raw, powerful form. It is not a magic shield against all suffering, but a persistent, costly cry that carves out pockets of grace right in the middle of consuming judgment. Perhaps you, too, carry someone like Lot in your heart. Someone who has chosen foolishly, who lives mired in a situation or a world you know is slowly eating them from the inside out. Someone confused, ethically compromised, but fundamentally not beyond reach. If their name rises in your mind right now, hold it, just as Abraham held Lot's name, before the eternal God. If you feel led, mark this profound moment by writing a simple phrase, a quiet vow of faith, over their troubled life. I will not give up. Do this not to impress others, but to remind your own heart that Abraham's deeply burdened calling, the calling to stand between the fire and the foolish, is now yours, too. From his distant hillside, Abraham likely did not know the specifics of the rescue. He did not know about Lot's agonizing lingering or the angelic hand that had grabbed his nephew's wrist, the terror of the race, the refuge in the tiny city of Zor. He saw only the consequence, the rising smoke. Faith often stands in places where we see the ash, but not the narrow, hidden escape contained within it, where we see the disaster, but not the divine rescue. Yet, heaven allows us to glimpse one crucial, powerful line. God remembered Abraham. Those three simple words are a seed that will grow across all of Scripture. God remembers Noah in the flood. He remembers Israel in the bitter oppression of Egypt. He remembers his covenant in every single generation. Divine memory is not merely sentimental nostalgia. It is fierce, purposeful action. It is God moving decisively in the present because of a solemn promise he made in the past. For Abraham, the sight of the burning valley must have carried a double weight of revelation. On one hand, it was a confirmation that the judge of all the earth had indeed done what was perfectly just. On the other, it was a sobering, terrifying realization that the nations he was called to bless were capable of such deep, self-destructive darkness that only purifying fire could provide the answer. What kind of people would his descendants need to be if they were to stand as a light in a world like this, a world that consumed itself? What kind of heart would it require to carry the sacred promise into places that might one day face the same kind of divine reckoning? Down in Zoar, the small city spared for his sake, Lot's story was far from finished. Judgment may have ended in the valley itself, but its psychological shadows still lay heavy across his small, traumatized family. Trauma does not dissolve simply because the immediate danger has passed. Travels often silently. It mutates into fear and bitterness. It shapes choices made in hidden caves and late-night whispers. We must follow Lot away from Zoar, into the loneliness of the hills, and watch how fear, shame, and deeply unresolved grief combine to give birth to nations whose tragic names, Moab and Ammon, will echo and clash through the rest of the biblical record. Zoar was supposed to be the refuge, a little city spared for Lot's sake, a small pocket of normalcy clinging desperately to the edge of a valley that now only existed as a smoking ruin. But safety on the map is not the same as safety in the soul. Lot had seen too much. He had watched the sky explode in fire. He had felt the visceral shock of the earth splitting beneath his feet. He had lost his wife in one single, foolish backward glance. Every smell, every sound, every shadow in Zoar must have reminded him that the world could change utterly and without warning. Fear began to whisper its corrosive message. If God's judgment reached great Sodom, how long before it reaches this small, exposed refuge? So Lot abandoned the city that had been specifically given to him as an act of mercy. He went up into the terrifying loneliness of the hills with his 2 daughters and lived, hidden, in a cave, from the wide, beautiful plains and the busy, powerful gates of Sodom. His path had narrowed, physically, morally, and spiritually, with every single choice. The cave, in this context, is much more than a location. It is a profound state of mind, a symbol of isolation and defeat. Inside, the silence grew thick and suffocating. No servants, no vast herds, no comforting city noise. Just 3 exhausted survivors and an echoing, primal darkness. Trauma sat between them like a fourth, invisible presence. Memories of flames, of running, of a mother's distinct shape suddenly vanishing from the path behind them. They had escaped the external judgment of the valley, but the terror of the valley had not yet left them. Escaping judgment does not equate to being healed. Lot's daughters looked out from the shadowed mouth of the cave at a world that, to their broken minds, seemed utterly emptied. Their last glimpse of human society had been an entire city being erased from the map. Their last attempt to warn others, the men pledged to marry them, had been met only with mocking laughter. Their father, once a respected man who sat in the gate, now hid in a hole in the hill, paralyzed by fear. Fear began to tell its own false story. "There is not a man on earth," they said to each other, "to come into us after the manner of all the earth." They were wrong, of course. The earth was not empty. Abraham still lived and thrived nearby. Nations still moved beyond the horizon. But trauma has a cruel way of shrinking reality until your isolated cave feels like the entire, barren universe. Despair almost always speaks in absolute terms. No one, nowhere, never. It paints a world in which God's options seem utterly exhausted, and only desperate human solutions remain. The daughters of Lot devised a plan. It was a choice shaped not by active faith or moral principle but by overriding fear, and sadly, by the warped relativistic norms they had absorbed during their long tenure in Sodom, a culture where ethical boundaries had long ago been trampled and dismissed. They sought to preserve their family line by crossing a line that should never be crossed, tragically drawing their fearful, passive father into their incestuous scheme. The Bible does not sensationalize this tragic event. It records it with a grave, profound brevity, neither excusing the action nor lingering unnecessarily on the details. That brevity itself is a kind of warning, suggesting that sin's most tragic moments are often quiet, born not out of wild, open rebellion, but out of a deep hopelessness that has simply forgotten how to look up toward divine promise. From these acts 2 sons were born. The first was named Moab, meaning, from the father. The name itself carried the shameful memory of the cave in its very syllables, a tragic label that would echo through generations of conflict. The second, Ben-Ami, meaning son of my people, would be the ancestor of the fierce Ammonites. Two nations were formed not in the light of Abraham's promise, but in the shadow of Lot's unhealed fear and the compromise of the cave. Their future would be complex and contradictory. Moab would one day entice Israel into widespread idolatry and destructive immorality on the plains of Moab, provoking another terrible wave of divine anger. Yet, from Moab would also come Ruth, a woman whose extraordinary loyalty and profound humility would graft her permanently into the sacred line of David, and through David into the direct lineage of the Messiah. A people born in the cave of compromise would one day shelter a heart that clung to God more tightly than many within Israel itself. Ammon would stand at Israel's borders as both neighbor and constant enemy, sometimes trading, often warring viciously. Prophets would raise their voices against its characteristic cruelty and insolence. Kings of Israel would constantly clash with its determined armies. The descendants of Lot's fear would become a constant, troublesome presence on the very edge of the Promised Land, a living geopolitical reminder that the past, when not fully healed and repented of, can become a permanent, aggressive neighbor to the people of God. Our private wounds and concealed decisions truly can write public history. Decisions made in the darkness of a cave can shape the destinies of generations. Lot himself quietly fades from the text. The man who once chose the fertile valley for its glittering beauty and sat in the influential gate of Sodom ends his days in utter obscurity, surrounded by the consequences of a life lived too close to the consuming edge of God's judgment and too far from the nurturing center of his promise. He is not entirely erased from the story. Peter will much later call him righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked. But his life is marked far more by rescue than by any profound testimony. He stands as a tragic mirror held up to every believer who tries to dwell too close to Sodom and yet desperately hopes to keep a tender, unsullied conscience. It is dreadfully possible to be saved and yet permanently scarred, to be pulled from the fire and yet forever carry its lingering smoke in your lungs. But even in this bleak, dark cave, grace whispers its persistent promise. God does not hide the miserable origin of Moab and Ammon from us. He lets us see the brokenness at their very root, and then, later in the story, he lets us see how he can and will weave redemption even through such intensely tangled, compromised beginnings. The lineage of the Messiah will eventually hold a Moabitess woman, proving once again that divine mercy can courageously walk into any broken family tree, any tragic history, and claim it fully for something new, something glorious. The story of Sodom does not end only in ash and pillars of salt. It also ends in this cold, desperate cave, where the survivors of judgment struggle violently to imagine a future, and where God, though unseen, is already planning to bring a Redeemer through the very nations born in that darkness. In the final, brief part of this reflection, we step back definitively from the smoke and the cave to ask the hardest, most enduring questions. What does the terrifying example of Sodom teach us fundamentally about God, about the nature of ourselves, and about a world that still walks dangerously close to the same self-made fire? Sodom is not just an ancient story about them. It is an uncomfortable mirror held up to us. When we look back over this difficult journey, the radical call of Abram, the glittering, tempting valley, the nameless, rising cries from the alleyways, the consuming fire, the isolated cave, we are not just observing ancient history. We are watching the relentless collision of three unchanging realities: the blazing holiness of God, the certainty of inevitable judgment, and the stubborn, surprising, and profound reach of divine grace. Holiness means that God is fundamentally not like us. He is not merely a slightly better, more ethical version of our best selves. He is pure, blazing, morally perfect, utterly separate. The God who walked as a gentle guest under Abraham's tree is the exact same God who listened to the ignored outcry of the oppressed in Sodom and ultimately declared, "Enough." Judgment is not what happens when God loses his temper in a fit of pique. Judgment is what happens when God finally stands up in defense of those whom no one else on earth will defend. But grace is fiercely present, too, in every single scene. It is there when Abram is called out of a pagan world to become a future blessing to all families of the earth. It is there when God pauses his divine plan to tell Abraham what he is about to do, inviting the patriarch into costly intercession instead of leaving him in ignorant despair. It is profoundly there when the angels must forcibly grab Lot's hesitating hand, dragging him toward life when his own compromised will was too weak and fragmented to choose it. Three distinct figures walk out of this ancient story and stand forever before us as archetypes. Abraham, the intercessor; Lot, the compromiser; Lot's wife, the divided heart. Abraham stands defiantly on the ridge, daring to ask if a mere handful of righteous people could hold back the flood of necessary judgment. He is not perfect. He has his own moments of profound fear and failure. But when God reveals his terrifying plan, Abraham does not shrug and say, "They deserved it." He immediately steps into the gap. He calls God the judge of all the earth, and at the same moment pleads passionately for mercy on people whose names and faces he does not know. This posture is shocking and utterly necessary in a world that universally loves to condemn from a safe, self-righteous distance. Abraham reminds us that the people of faith are never mere spectators of judgment. They are called to be dedicated intercessors in a violent, indifferent, and cynical age. They see the same smoke others see, but instead of feeling vindicated in their warnings, they feel terribly burdened by the sheer tragedy of it all. Lot, by contrast, lives deep inside the city he cannot fully embrace. The New Testament rightly remembers him as righteous Lot, someone deeply distressed by the wicked conduct he saw. He is not spiritually at home in Sodom's sin, and yet he raises his family there. He settles his house there. He sits in the gate of influence. He negotiates instead of leaves. He believes the divine warnings, but he tragically lingers when the time comes to finally go. Lot is what happens when faith loses its sharp, distinct edges. He believes just enough to be constantly tormented by the evil, but not enough to be truly distinct from it. He is not a villain, but a profound warning. It is perilously possible to belong to God and still build your entire life too close to the consuming flames. Then there is Lot's wife. Jesus himself reaches back across 15 centuries of history and pulls her into his own teaching with one short, devastating sentence. Remember Lot's wife. The Lord of history does not say remember Sodom, though he speaks of its judgment. He says, remember the one who almost escaped. Her physical body was finally on the road out, but her heart was irrevocably rooted in the city behind her. In a single, fatal moment of turning back, she became an icon of divided loyalty. She did not openly fight God. She simply could not imagine her own future without what God had already decided to leave in ruins. The tragedy of modern faith is not that we openly reject God, but that we try to walk forward with him while our hearts remain secretly welded to a world that stands under judgment. The later writers of the New Testament do not file Sodom away as an historical oddity. Peter points to Sodom as a definitive example of what happens when judgment finally comes, and at the same time, as evidence that the Lord decisively knows how to rescue the godly from their trials. Jude recalls Sodom and Gomorrah as cities that serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire, not to satisfy intellectual curiosity, but to shatter spiritual complacency. Jesus compares the days of his return to the days of Lot. People eating, drinking, buying, selling, planting, building, until suddenly, without warning, the fire falls. Sodom's greatest sin was not simply that it did evil things, but that it did them while life felt perfectly normal, utterly safe, and unshakable. So what does this ancient, scarred valley say to a modern world that builds its own glowing, impenetrable cities, its own intricate systems of power, and its own sophisticated ways of ignoring the desperate needy at the gate? It calls us to profound repentance, to turn not just in outward behavior, but in deep inward affection, to refuse the self-congratulatory pride that says we are untouchable, to resist the systemic cruelty that treats human beings as disposable commodities, to recover the lost art of radical hospitality, not just as simple politeness, but as spiritual warfare against a prevailing culture of icy indifference. It calls us to live like Abraham, as pilgrims, not as permanent settlers, people with temporary tents and built altars, instead of massive, self-glorifying towers and secure thrones. People who fundamentally understand that we are strangers and exiles on the earth, whose true, perfect city is still yet to come. People who dare to stand before God on behalf of the places we live, not with aggressive arrogance, but with honest tears and a heavy burden. Most of all, it calls us to seek genuine refuge. Not in a small, compromised zor of our own anxious making. Not in a little corner of compromise we desperately hope God will overlook and spare, but entirely in a Redeemer who walked completely into judgment in our place. The one infinitely greater than Abraham who did not only plead for the wicked, but tragically died for them, offering himself up. He is the one to whom every smoke-filled valley finally points. The one in whose wounded, crucified hands justice and mercy ultimately, eternally embrace. If Sodom is truly a mirror, then the final, most crucial question is not why were they destroyed. The final, pressing question is, where are we standing right now? Are we standing at the gate, laughing cynically at the possibility that anything could ever change? Are we standing confused in the house, torn hopelessly between the fear of God and the deep-seated love for the city? Are we on the long, difficult road out, our feet moving forward, but our hearts still stubbornly turned back toward the ruin? Or are we on the spiritual hillside with Abraham, watching the smoke rise, holding on fiercely to a great promise and a profound, necessary burden at the exact same time? Somewhere between the rough tent of Abraham and the tragic ashes of Sodom, each of us must urgently decide what kind of story we will be a part of. We have walked from the calling of Abram to the burning of the valley, from the laughter of divine promise to the silence of cold ash. We have watched holiness violently confront corruption, judgment fall like fire, and grace reach miraculously into places where no one deserved rescue. Sodom is physically gone, but the fundamental questions it asks are still very much alive. Questions about who we are, what we truly love, and where we ultimately place our trust when the world around us feels suddenly and profoundly unshakable. And now, as the smoke finally fades and the sky grows quiet, the story releases us, but it cannot leave us unchanged. Its harrowing lessons linger in the heart, asking not only what happened to them, but what may yet happen to us if we foolishly forget. If this journey stirred you, share it now. Someone you love may desperately need the sobering warning and the quiet hope woven together here. Like the video so this crucial message can travel further. Subscribe and walk with us as we continue uncovering the hidden, necessary stories of Scripture. Leave a comment below. What did Sodom teach you that you never truly saw before? We read every reflection. Stay with us. The next film will open another sealed door where history and faith powerfully intertwine, and a new mystery begins to speak. Between ashes and dawn, the truth still rises.